When I was in second grade, my parents transferred me from a private school to a public school in my area. Now, of course, in kindergarten and first grade, I had learned the basics, adding, subtracting, the simple things. But I hadn't learned how to do either of those things fast. And so at my new school, they had these crazy things called time tests. Anybody remember time tests? Yeah, if you haven't taken them before, you're not very good at them. And so I started being the good, studious 7-year-old I was. I started in on my time test very quickly, and I worked really hard, and at the end of like 4 or 5 minutes, I had done a whopping 13. Now, I was pretty naive, and so I thought that that was pretty good. And then a couple days later, the scores were posted, and I had gotten the lowest score in the class. Everybody else was like in the 20s, 30s, because they'd been doing time tests. And I remember feeling just small, queasy, just embarrassed of what I had done. I felt like I had failed. But I knew something at 7 years old. I knew that if I worked hard enough, that I could get better and that I could avoid feeling that way. And so I used that same strategy all the way through college and graduate school. And I even capped off my college career with a chancellor's medallion and being selected as commencement speaker. Now I had the typical bumps in the road along the way. It wasn't all smooth sailing, but for the most part, I did pretty well. And I continued to do well until 369 days ago, when I experienced one of the greatest failures of my life. And it meant everything changed. I had to change jobs, my career plan changed, and I had to leave the state that I had formed a really great community in. And so today I'm here to tell you parts of my story, tell you some of the things that I've learned along the way, and some of the things that you can gain, yep, you heard me, gain from failing. I'm also here as an alum of the UWGB psychology program and a professional with a master's degree in clinical psychology. So I'm going to be talking about some research along the way too. The first lesson I learned was that the best way out is always through. And so that's actually a Robert Frost quote. He's much smarter than I am. And so for me, being someone who's really into mindfulness-based clinical interventions in my work, and who also loves yoga, I knew this meant I had to press in. I had to take the mindful way through. I had to be intentional, I had to be present, and I had to practice some skills that I'm going to be talking about today. And so I kind of felt my way through this. And actually, there's some research that backs me up on this as well. So the first lesson I titled, Press In. And there's actually a study by Curry et al. Who looked at meta-analytic data from 29 studies. So he took 29 studies, put all the data together, and found that individuals who were more mindful, used more mindfulness-based coping strategies, tended to have lower stress, lower anxiety, lower depression, lower distress, and lower burnout. Now, the interesting thing is not only that this works, that just simply being present, being intentional, taking the mindful way through works, but these were healthy individuals. These were not individuals in treatment for any sort of psychological condition. And so taking the mindful way through is an effective way to go through it. So the first lesson that I learned, the second lesson I learned, the first lesson was like, be present. The second one is to hold myself to a standard of grace, not perfection. Now, this was actually my background on my phone because I had lived for a long time with a standard of perfection for myself. And that meant that my work was usually top-notch, but I often wasn't fully satisfied. It never felt like I had really achieved what I was capable of. I never felt fully fulfilled. And so standard of perfection is great, but it's also kind of miserable. And it's not at all adaptive when you're facing a crushing failure. And so I had to work hard to show myself some grace and to hold myself to that. What psychological research, so I said constantly showing myself grace, but psychological research actually calls this self-compassion. And so this is the best definition that I could find for self-compassion. So self-compassion is being open to and aware of one's own suffering, offering kindness and understanding towards oneself, desiring the self's well-being, taking a non-judgmental attitude towards one's inadequacies and failures, and framing one's own experience in light of the common human experience. And so this sounds really, really easy, but it's really hard to do when you're kind of going through a stormy season of life. But for folks who are able to have self-compassion for themselves, sure, it works. They tend to have a less negative view of themselves in response to negative feedback. They also tend to have increased resilience in the face of stress. And they're able to place a safer emotional distance from situations that threaten their ability to have compassion or to have grace for themselves. And it also accounts for a significant proportion of college students' well-being. So if you can cut yourself some slack, you do a little bit better. And so this was the lesson that I had to learn. The next lesson that I had to learn was to be grateful. And I like this quote because it sums up exactly what I experienced. Gratitude turns what you have, regardless of the season, I'll add that little bit, into enough. And so as I was going through the dark days after failure, it was hard to be grateful. If you can think about kind of a dark season of life, it's hard to be grateful. But it was so worth the work of learning to be grateful. And I was grateful for little things. So it was no longer I'm grateful I got an A. It was grateful for time with friends, grateful for enough money for a cup of coffee from Starbucks. It was little things that I found. Every little bit of good that I could find during that time, I wrote down in a gratitude app. So that's actually a screenshot of the gratitude app I used. So it was really easy to just take pictures of things. Anything that made me feel even a little bit good, I would record. And what research shows is that individuals who are able to be grateful tend to have an increased level of adaptive coping, a greater sense of well-being, and they also tend to have lower levels of anxiety and depression. Now, the last lesson I learned probably carried me the farthest. So this quote best sums up. So the last lesson I learned was to have hope. And Desmond Tutu said it best. Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. Now, I lost a lot in December of 2015, but one of the things I never lost was hope. I never once lost sight of what was to come and the good that still was to come. And so that probably carried me the farthest. And so just when you're going through a tough season, you want to make sure that you have hope, because that really made it easier to continue to press on. So I'm still on my journey. In some ways, it feels like I'm still beginning my journey through failure. But I can tell you what happened in the first 368 days since I experienced this failure. So after experiencing failure, I took a few weeks to take care of myself and just get my feet back on the ground so that I could hit the ground running. Then I spent 6 months applying to over 30 jobs across the country and ended up finding a job in Indianapolis, where I'm now currently a psychometrist in the Department of Neuropsychology. And so I mean, as I stand here today, I really value the lessons that I learned, and my intention for this talk was to kind of teach you kind of my way through and show you that it is possible to kind of gain a lot of lessons. I know going through failure and it's not something that we all look forward to, but I can say I am stronger, I am braver, and I am so much wiser having walked the path that I have walked. And so going forward, I just encourage you to press in and to learn all that you can from failure, because failure is not fatal. It's perhaps one of the greatest teachers that you can find. And so I just implore you to press in and to take the mindful way through and just learn everything you can from it. Thank you.